Hey, welcome! Today we're diving into a really fascinating and specific theological argument within Islam. It's all about its primary sources of guidance, and we're going to unpack a case for why one might be considered sufficient all on its own. So the argument we're exploring kicks off with this very direct, very provocative question. It immediately sets the stage for the core conflict we're going to look at today, a choice between trusting God's direct word or the compilations of a human scholar. All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll tackle that central question of trust between the two main texts. Then, we'll get into the source's critique of the Hadith, and follow that with its argument for why the Quran is all you need. And finally, we'll look at what the author says are the ultimate consequences of making this choice. Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, a question of trust. To get started, we've got to define the two core sources that are at the very heart of this entire debate. So first, we have the Quran. Now, from the perspective of the argument we're exploring, this is seen as the direct, complete, and divinely protected Word of God. No intermediaries, just pure revelation. And then, on the other hand, you've got the Hadith. Now, for the vast majority of Muslims, these collections of the Prophet's sayings and actions are absolutely essential. But the source we're looking at today hones in on a really key detail. They were put together by scholars, like the famous Imam Bukhari, about a couple of hundred years after the Prophet had passed away.
And this is where the source really starts to draw a line in the sand. You can see it here. The Quran is presented as a single, divinely authored book from the Prophet's time, while the Hadith are framed as many volumes of attributed sayings compiled by a human centuries down the line.
All right, moving into Section 2. This is where we really get into the nitty-gritty of the argument against relying on these human compilations for religious law. So the main point here is that Hadith allegedly introduces a lot of rules and complexity that you just don't find in the Quran. The author uses the example of food prohibitions. The Quran lists just 4 simple ones, but the Hadith books apparently add so many more that trying to follow them all would, and I'm quoting here, lead to a miserable life. And to back this up, the source brings in this verse from the Quran, basically arguing that making up new rules about what's allowed and what's forbidden is a pretty serious offense. The takeaway here is that you should stick to what God has clearly laid out without adding to it. But the argument doesn't just stay in the realm of theology. It gets into the numbers with something it calls the Bukhari math problem, which uses some simple arithmetic to question if Imam Bukhari's massive project was even physically possible. Okay, it all starts with this one massive number, 600,000. That's the reported number of individual sayings or hadith that Bukhari is said to have collected and sifted through during his lifetime. Now think about that number. Out of all 600,000 of those sayings, Bukhari himself is said to have accepted only about 1% as authentic. That means he rejected the other 99%. The source highlights this to suggest that even the compiler himself found the vast majority of what was floating around to be unreliable. Okay, so this is where the math problem really comes into play. Let's walk through the logic. The source calculates that even if Bukhari spent just 1 hour on each hadith to check it, verify it, and write it down, that's 600,000 hours, which, if you do the math, comes out to almost 68 years of working around the clock 24/7. And here's the kicker. Bukhari lived for 62 years. So the author's point is, the timeline just doesn't seem to add up, and that's before you even think about basic stuff like traveling, sleeping, or eating. All right, on to Section 3. So after laying out the critique of the Hadith, the source then builds its positive case for why the Quran, and only the Quran, is all you need. And the whole argument really boils down to these key ideas. The claim is that the Quran itself says it's complete, that it's sufficient for salvation, that it's easy to get, and that it's protected by God from any mistakes or contradictions, which, would make any other book for religious rules kind of redundant. For example, the author points to verses just like this one, which calls the Quran a detailed explanation of all things. So the question being raised here is, if the book itself says it has everything, why would you need to look somewhere else for guidance? Now, this next verse is a really big one for this argument, mainly because it shows up 4 separate times in the Quran. The source uses this repetition to push back against the whole idea that you need the hadith to explain a text that's supposedly too hard to understand. The point being made is, God himself says he made it easy.
And then there's this really stern warning from the Quran. The way it's interpreted here is that the Prophet Muhammad himself was basically ordered not to add any religious teachings of his own beyond what was revealed in the Quran. It's used to really hammer home that idea of the Quran's exclusivity as the one divine source.
Okay, section 4. So what's the big deal? Why does all this matter? Well, according to the source, this isn't just some dusty old academic debate. It has huge consequences for a person's faith and salvation.
And this is a really powerful claim. The source argues that this whole turn towards Hadith was basically a way to split the religion into different groups, to create sects, and to muddy the waters by mixing human error with God's clear message. It's framed as a major fork in the road, a deviation from the straight path. And really, this question from the Quran kind of sums up the entire argument. It just boils everything down to one simple, powerful point: trust that God is enough. The author suggests that bringing in other books for religious law is like setting up idols next to God. And the argument closes with this beautiful, powerful series of verses, all pulled from different parts of the Quran, but they all echo the same exact theme: God's total, absolute sovereignty. Everything belongs to God. All judgment, all control, it's all His.
So that's really the final takeaway from the material we've been looking at today. The argument concludes that this choice between the Quran and other sources isn't just about books. It's a fundamental decision about where you place your ultimate trust and submission.